Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Warriors for Justice. How are you? It is such an honor to be here with you today. And Annie, let me thank you for that incredible introduction, but also for the years of friendship, for the years of tutelage. If you ever hear me say anything smart about immigration on television or in committee, it's because of her. And also for all the wisdom and passion that you bring. And Ada Shanjafi, thank you for your leadership, your brilliance, and for all of the work that you've done. I know you say you're retired, but does anybody really think that Ada Shanjafi retires? I don't think so. I also want to thank the Access for Justice Board and the Planning Committee for having me here. I think it might be my third time to Access to Justice to keynote for you, and how wonderful it is today to come back as the Congress member for the 7th Congressional District and the first Indian American woman in the U.S. House of Representatives. And also the first woman to represent the 7th District and the first person of color in the Washington State Democratic delegation to Congress. I'm really proud about is that I'm one of the very few organizers in Congress, and I'm also, I think, one of only maybe a dozen or 14 people in Congress who have been born outside of the United States. And when I think about why that's important, it's important not because of me, not because of these firsts, but because of what it says to people across this country, women, immigrants, people of color, and what it says about how we actually represent the experiences that we have in Congress. Now, these things matter not just because diversity is nice to say and the pictures look good, though I do think we look really good in the pictures, but because it actually matters to how we chair hearings, how we listen to testimonies, and how we craft legislation, because our lived experiences matter. And so for me, as an immigrant who came to this country when I was 16 years old, by myself, to the experience of being denied a room because of the color of my skin right here in Yakima, to the experience of starting and running One America for 12 years, now the largest immigrant advocacy organization in the state, one of the largest in the country, and to understanding both from a personal and a collective perspective that race, gender, and class are intertwined and have to be recognized both in cause and in effect. And these are the lived experiences that I hope will help me to represent you and the people of the 7th and people who are working for justice across the country. Now, I know that the people in this room understand better than anyone the dangers of the moment and the seemingly unrelenting disasters unfolding on the national stage as too many elected and appointed leaders lose their moral compass. And let's give the servers in the room a round of applause for their work. Too many elected and appointed leaders lose their moral compass while holding tightly to a dehumanizing, toxic, and dangerous ideology. You are all too familiar with the painful consequences of that ideology, what it has already wrought and what it will bring. You in this room are some of our most vital first responders in the essential work of defending the civil and human rights of all of us and the progress that we've made in the last half century towards equity and justice. As a lawyer or a worker in the legal profession, you have a degree of privilege that for many is unimaginable. As public interest lawyers, you have chosen to channel that privilege into the service of work that seeks to ensure access to justice for individuals and communities that experience the combined effects of poverty and racism. And so now, more than ever, you are once again called upon to use your talents to mitigate harm and bear witness to the suffering as our marginalized communities come under further assault. Immigrants caught up in the widening ICE dragnet facing deportation. People accused of crimes facing increased risk of mass incarceration as federal criminal justice reform efforts falter. And low-income people facing the threat of spiraling into poverty as critical legal and social services disappear. A lyrical quote from Rebecca Solnit, who's a friend and a wonderful author and a wise and necessary public intellectual, offers a useful metaphor. This is what she says. The stars we are given, but the constellations we make. That is to say, stars exist in the cosmos, but constellations are the imaginary lines we draw between them, the readings we give the sky, the stories we tell. Each of us gathered here are stars that exist in the cosmos of our collective journey. The institutions, organizations, and networks that we create make up those imaginary lines drawn between us, and they help bring together the relationships that we build and nurture. And as these imaginary lines constellate, they become the stories we tell. For me, I believe our prescription forward is to be truth-telling, storytelling, and rebelling. We can't have hope for the future, genuine, deeply felt hope, unless we're honest with ourselves about where we are, what we have to do, how far we have come, and how far we have to go. And that means being honest not just about the successes we've had, but also the continued struggle around institutionalized racism that permeates our educational, criminal justice, and work institutions. Because we cannot bend the arc towards justice unless we know what we're bending toward. And the truth is that we still have a long way to go in being able to tell the truth. Not quietly in rooms of people who we know agree with us, but loudly with those friends and family members and those who still don't see what we see and who don't agree with us. If there's anything that this election taught us, it may be that we do have farther to go than what we sometimes acknowledge. So the stories we tell help us to stay aligned to each other and our own moral compass, even when the larger political narrative may seem out of grasp. As organizers, we've always believed in the power story, not only of hardship and heartache, but of resilience and power in the face of that hardship. So victims of violence are not just victims, they are survivors. And immigrant women are not just weeping for the loss of their children, but they are courageous actors who continue to speak truth to power while keeping their households going. All of these are truths wrapped together in our stories, but sometimes only a piece of those stories is told. The complete stories that we create fuel our endurance, sustain our faith in times of despair, and help renew us for the long haul. And then the rebelling. Well, you know, one of the titles of a speech I gave was From Handcuffs to Elected Office. So here I am. And if there's any silver lining to the outrageous things that are happening under this administration, it is that the resistance is alive and well. After November 8th, we strengthened our alliances, doubled down on our efforts to ensure justice for all, and reinforced our commitments to keep a tenacious grip on the hard-won gains of the past 60 years. And Washington State, you in this room, have been on the vanguard of the resistance in ways large and small, but all incredibly meaningful. Many of you in this room and the organizations and institutions that you represent have been instrumental in some of our most successful and high-profile acts of resistance. Individually impressive, but collectively constellating the power of our stories of resistance, inspiration, and success. So as Annie said, SeaTac Airport was ground zero after the Muslim ban 1.0, and with the Port of Seattle, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, pro bono attorneys from McDonald Hogan Bayless and the ACLU, we were all there within hours, fighting to get people off of planes, filing temporary restraining orders, and literally banging down the door of the CBP office to be able to talk to those in charge. In fact, when someone asked me in those first few months how I liked my new job in Congress, I said, it's a lot like my old job, threatening to shut down airports, calling up all of our folks to protest, and thousands showed up within hours and stopping people from being deported. But make no mistake, it was the people that turned out in thousands in airports across the country, from SeaTac to JFK, that pushed the issue to the forefront of the news. It was a diversity of neighbors of all colors who refused to leave the airports and had signs welcoming our Muslim brothers and sisters, lawyers donating time, and the absolute conviction of love and welcome and resistance that said to this president, "This is our country and we are going to fight for it." And that allowed space for our wonderful Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, and his dedicated, brilliant staff to lead the legal battle resisting the racist, xenophobic travel bans. And then our very own Chief Justice, Mary Fairhurst. Where are you, Mary? You were here. There you are. Our very own Chief Justice, supported by the other 8 justices, was the second state Supreme Court justice in the country to condemn ICE's practice of apprehending non-citizens appearing for court, a practice that erodes the fundamental mission of our courts, which is to ensure access to justice for everyone. So thank you for that, Chief Justice. And with the passage of its welcoming resolution within weeks of the election, Seattle was one of the first cities to condemn the new administration's executive orders. And within months, Seattle also led one of the first lawsuits challenging the targeting of the so-called sanctuary cities and pledged more than $1 million to bolster community defense efforts. And of course, the work of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project and my dear friend Jorge Barón, who, while representing hundreds of individual clients each day, has been a leading force and voice here in Washington and nationally. And so when I get discouraged, and it does happen sometimes, I think back to 9/11, when I first started what was then Hate-Free Zone, now One America. And I think about how far we have come. The decades of organizing work from so many in this room have paid off, because I remember that back then, there were very few elected officials who actually stood with us. That when there was an imam from a mosque who was going to be deported, the only elected official I could get there was the wonderful King County Council member Larry Gossett. But we can give a hand for Larry Gossett. But today I am so proud of our governor, our county executive, mayors, and the Democratic delegation to Congress who have all stood firmly because of the organizing space that was created and the work of decades, not just since 9/11, but decades before, of organizations and movements for justice. Back then, when Hate-Free Zone and NERC began working on that first so-called sanctuary city ordinance to establish Seattle as a city that wouldn't ask about immigration status, I remember that it took, and I went back and looked at the documents, it took us a year to get the city council to pass that. And we had all this pro bono help from Perkins Coie to do research on that. And many years later, Annie knows we shed a lot of tears around trying to get the King County detainer ordinance through, but we got that through. And so today, our county and city and our state have all said that they will forego federal funds if forced to enforce immigration laws that tear apart our communities. And in Congress, where we just had 3 horrendously long days on the Judiciary Committee where I'm a member, we are fighting back on the unjust, often unconstitutional, and inhumane bills to criminalize 11 million undocumented immigrants and unleash a mass deportation force across our communities. So any successes in our history that we have come because of the combination of great organizing and resistance, great lawyering in the courts, and the holding of the moral compass in the political realm. And for me, as Annie said, that holding of the moral compass has meant not only being an opposition party, because there is a lot that we have to oppose, and we need to be at the forefront of opposition, but also being a proposition party. We must propose a vision of the country that we want to see in the community that we want to uphold. And that is why I'm proud of that Access to Legal Counsel bill that Kamala Harris and I introduced in the House and the Senate. It was in response to the Muslim ban, but it was also in response to what I had seen and known for decades, which is that we desperately need to provide legal counsel in order to have due process for immigrants who are detained. And the College for All bill, which will provide, as Annie said, free college for our young people across the country, isn't just about young people, because the fastest growing demographic of people with college loans today is grandparents. Grandparents who are taking on the college debt of their young people because there's no other way to pay that back. $1.4 trillion in student loan debt today in this country, more than credit card debt. But most of all, the dashing of dreams for people across this country who used to believe that education was something that could help them to get ahead. I'm also a sponsor of the Raise the Wage Act, which would take what we did in Seattle and raise the federal minimum wage to $15 in 2024. That was introduced by our own Senator, Patty Murray, and Bernie Sanders in the Senate, and Keith Ellison and Bobby Scott in the House. And just a few weeks ago, we launched with two of my new colleagues of color, Nanette Berrigan and Don McEachin, a new United for Climate and Environmental Justice caucus with the Asian American Pacific Islander caucus, the Black caucus, and the Hispanic caucus. Because especially in the wake of Trump's exit from the Paris Climate Agreement, we refuse to sit back. We will continue to push the envelope and implement real solutions that address the increased burdens of climate change on low-income people, limited English speakers, immigrants, and people of color. So I fought very hard to serve on the Judiciary Committee, which is not an easy task as a new member and also as a non-lawyer. And I'm proud to be on that committee where my colleagues, my Democratic colleagues, and I have fought hard against the legislative attempts to eliminate class action lawsuits. That passed at around 7 p.m. on Thursday night with no hearings. To place a cap on medical malpractice lawsuits, and then of course the horrendous enforcement-only bills that I mentioned. And one thing that all of these bills have in common is, in my opinion, they are racing away from justice and not towards it. As the vice-ranking member of the Budget Committee, where I had the opportunity to deliver the opening statement for Democrats when Director Mick Mulvaney came in to testify before us on the budget, I call the budget what it is, which is extreme and immoral. It cuts $1.5 trillion from Medicaid, guts Planned Parenthood, access to legal services, public education and housing, cuts meals for seniors, life-saving research at the NIH and the CDC, and 30% of the EPA, an agency that I really believe we should rename to be the Agency for Human Health, Clean Air, and Clean Water. The Trump budget invests $1.5 billion as a down payment into a wall along the southern border to nowhere that is expected to cost $40 billion and does nothing to fix our immigration system while terrorizing our border communities and immigrants in our country. And it unleashes a mass deportation force across the country and expands investments in private prisons, which is why, by the way, those private prison stocks are soaring even as campaign contributions to GOP members increase. But perhaps worst of all to me, Director Mulvaney attempted to do something that I think was truly tragic, and that is to redefine compassion as austerity. He said that it was compassionate to cut poor people off nutrition assistance and job training and child care assistance so that they don't become dependent. He said it's smart to give $1 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthiest amongst us because, of course, the wealthiest need more and know what to do with it. I can tell you that we are fighting back hard against these things, and I will have your back, not only in introducing legislation that keeps a strong north on our moral compass and presents the vision of what we believe in as a country, but also in organizing within Congress and outside, amplifying each other's voices so that we build the strongest resistance movement possible and we could put our country back on the right track. Now, I want to take a minute to say that while the high-profile actions get a lot of news coverage and are essential to our defense and our stories, equally critical is the daily work of communities and organizations across our state, those that are newly formed and those that have forged new and stronger relationships. From Colectiva del Pueblo to Care Washington, from the ACLU to One America, from organized labor to educators, from Clark County to Spokane, Jefferson County to Walla Walla, Olympia to Seattle, and Yakima to the Skagit Valley, the imaginary lines of relationship are combining and drawing us closer across our state. And some of the most important work happening in those communities are the efforts to push and support local government officials to use the powers at their disposal to form the bulwark of resistance. One of the most inspirational stories to emerge from the wreckage is a renewed interest in and focus on the powers of local governments to protect and support their communities. And so important networks such as the Faith Communities Coalitions, the Immigrant Solidarity Network, and the Justice Action Network are consolidating grassroots and grass-tops power across Washington. And those efforts are working to harness collective power, not only to protect immigrants and their families from deportation, but to catalyze movements that capitalize on the intersectional moment that is before us. I won't lie to you. The attacks that we face are serious, and they run deep, and they are part of a very organized strategy that goes something like this. You punish people, you starve them of resources for their health and well-being, and they will cast about looking for someone to blame for their dire conditions. It becomes all too easy for people to scapegoat vulnerable groups for economic hardship, to turn people's anger toward the other, whether immigrant, LGBT, or ethnic minorities. But in some very strange way, I have to tell you that I'm more hopeful than I have been for a while. And I admit that I have the organizer's disease of optimism, because it is extremely difficult to be an organizer for justice without being a wholehearted, unabashed optimist. But I do mean this, because I believe that crisis is that time when strength emerges. People who have never been awake politically are awake now. Who would have thought that emoluments would be the most popular word in the English language across the United States? Nobody can say that politics doesn't matter and that our votes don't count. I held 5 town halls in March and April because I'm not afraid of my constituents, and over 2,000 people showed up in person, and we had an additional 8,000 people that watched on Facebook live stream. And it was amazing. And at the first one, which was at the Seattle Town Hall, there were 1,000 people in the audience, and I asked people at the beginning to stand up if they had never been to such an event, if they had never talked to an elected official, if they had never participated politically. And 2/3 of the room stood up. It was remarkable. And so especially young people and women and people of color are energized in a whole new way to fight for their rights. And you can see it in the historic Women's March, the airport protests against the Muslim bans, and the energy that is increasingly reflected even in the actions of elected officials. So our task now is to redefine the narrative. Compassion is not austerity. It is investments in our common good. It is the conviction that instead of investing in jails and incarceration, we invest in education and resources, and we never let the for-profit prison system drive our policy. And our progressive, so-called progressive ideas of reforming criminal justice and immigrant detention and education, healthcare, voting rights, these are not far-left theories. They're actually common sense. They're actually what the vast majority of developed nations have already implemented, and they are what will build our country from the bottom up and the middle out. Our work needs to consider equity and place it at the forefront. Equity isn't about all communities getting the same thing, not at all. It's about the recognition that some communities have suffered more and need more resources and targeted programs to even reach the same baseline. We know that our vision is intersectional, that labor rights are tied to immigrant rights, and racial justice and gender justice and economic justice are inseparable. We cannot address wealth inequality and health disparities if we don't also acknowledge that it is those whose status is not equal, the homeless and the mentally ill, those in prisons, undocumented immigrants, Muslim women, Muslim refugees, women of color, transgender individuals, those with disabilities, people who have been left behind the furthest. It means that colorblind or gender-blind programs for criminal justice reform or in the justice system simply don't get us to where we need to be. We have to harness the power of our privilege to align with and be accountable to marginalized communities in order to dismantle institutions that perpetuate unjust and racist outcomes like mass incarceration or the criminalization of poverty or deportation. And you in this room are at the forefront of that. You've been leading those efforts to bridge the divide between the criminal justice system and the civil legal services. It's a divide that ensured that people in the communities that we serve get too much of one and not enough of another. And it prevents us from moving forward the holistic representation that marginalized people actually need. You in this room have worked to reform the system of legal financial obligations. You've established the Race Equity and Justice Initiative that is working to deconstruct a system that has maintained privilege at the expense of communities of color. And you're improving jail conditions and organizing amazing initiatives to bring power to those who are affected, like Civil Survival, I Did the Time, and the Black Prisoners Caucus. Together with the tremendous work of justice system actors, judges, prosecutors, public defender offices, civil legal services organizations, you are knitting together our constellation, our stars of justice in the sky, and it is why I am so, so proud of Washington State and this community that we have built together. And in the end, I believe that a truly transformational vision will emerge from these efforts. And it may not be something that we've seen before. It has to be grounded in human rights, but it might be a brand new synthesis of ideas, including ideas from young people, from activists, from thinkers and researchers in this very room. And I couldn't be more motivated and proud to be a part of those developments as a member of Congress who proudly wears the label I've been given by somebody as the anti-Trump. So as we sharpen our tools of resistance and focus our vision on that end of that moral arc of the universe, our path will become clear, and our intersectional program of justice will continue to emerge, countering the otherizing and the vilifying that we see around us with a beautiful, awe-inspiring sense of solidarity. And that simple idea that has guided me for so much of my life, and that is that we are all better off when we're all better off. Instead of scarcity and fear, our work will always focus on generosity and abundance, because generosity, after all, is one of the most powerful forces on earth. Generosity doesn't impute ill will or motivation when we disagree. Generosity recognizes all of our talents and our skills and invites them in, no matter how different we may be. Generosity recognizes that we don't have to be small for someone else to be big. Generosity recognizes the hierarchy of oppressions that holds everyone down, whereas many ladders offer pathways to many leaders, and we have so many leaders amongst us who we haven't even noticed yet. And, brothers and sisters, generosity isn't afraid to talk about love in politics, because in the end, love does trump hate, and love always wins. Thank you all so much.